Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There is something about examining forbidden knowledge across time zones, across the arbitrary divisions we've drawn on maps, that makes the work feel more authentic. We are going to spend considerable time together exploring a question that sounds deceptively simple. Which real cults, which actual religious movements and occult practices did Howard Phillips Lovecraft study when constructing his fictional cosmologies of worship? This is not a question about literary imagination alone, though imagination certainly played its role. This is a question about appropriation, about synthesis, about the strange alchemy that occurs when a deeply prejudiced New England antiquarian encounters anthropological reports from civilizations he considered degenerate. Lovecraft's fictional cults, the Cthulhu worshippers of the Pacific, the esoteric order of Dagon in decaying Innsmouth, the witch covens of Arkham, feel disturbingly plausible precisely because they are built upon foundations of actual religious history, actual occult traditions, actual human rituals that existed long before he put pen to paper. We will proceed methodically through the documentary evidence, his letters, his library records, the anthropological texts he is known to have consumed. We will examine how theosophy, witch trial transcripts, sensationalist journalism about exotic faiths, and early 20th century comparative religion all filtered through his peculiar consciousness to create something that feels ancient even as we know it to be invented. By the end, you will understand not simply what Lovecraft read, but why his synthesis continues to feel more real than it should. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was a meticulous correspondent, and it is through his letters, thousands of them, preserved and catalogued, that we can reconstruct with reasonable confidence what he actually read, what he claimed to have read, and what he invented entirely from atmospheric suggestion. Between 1917 and his death in 1937, Lovecraft maintained an extraordinarily detailed epistolary record of his intellectual pursuits, often describing in granular detail the books he encountered, the ideas they sparked, and the methods by which he transmuted research into fiction. This documentation reveals something crucial. Lovecraft was not simply imagining cults from whole cloth, nor was he deeply embedded in genuine occult practice. He occupied a third position, one we might call strategic appropriation. He studied real religious movements, real occult traditions, and real anthropological accounts with the specific intention of harvesting their most unsettling elements for fictional deployment. The Providence Athenaeum, that venerable library where he spent countless hours during his formative years, provided access to comparative religion texts, travelogues, and anthropological surveys that would have been considered cutting-edge scholarship in the 1920s. We know from library records and his own testimony that he consulted works on mythology, demonology, and what was then termed primitive religion with genuine fascination, even as his personal materialism prevented him from believing any of it. This creates a peculiar dynamic. A writer who intellectually rejected all supernatural claims nevertheless recognized the psychological power embedded in religious narratives, particularly those from cultures he viewed through the distorting lens of his era's racism. The tension between invention and appropriation runs through all of Lovecraft's cult creation. In a 1927 letter to fellow writer Clark Ashton Smith, he explicitly discusses his technique of blending anthropological verisimilitude with complete fabrication, noting that the most effective cosmic horror requires readers to feel they are encountering something that might have existed in forgotten corners of human history. This was not accidental atmosphere, but deliberate craft. Lovecraft understood that pure invention lacks the weight of accumulated human fear, while pure documentation lacks the artistic control necessary for narrative impact. His solution was synthesis. Take the structure of a real witch cult, the terminology of genuine Arabic occultism, the geographic specificity of actual Pacific Island cultures, and the theological frameworks of documented death cults, then recombine these elements into something that never existed but feels as though it should have. Consider his treatment of the Cthulhu cult in his 1926 story, The Call of Cthulhu. The tale features a Louisiana bayou community practicing rituals that Inspector LaGrasse and his police force discover in 1907. A completely fictional event, yet one that Lovecraft anchored in real contemporary anxieties about voodoo, about immigrant religious practices, about the supposed survival of savage faiths in modern America. He described the cultists' chant, Funglui Mgro Nuf, Cthulhu, Rulia, Wugahanago Ftagen, as something transcribed phonetically by confused police officers, giving it the documentary texture of genuine anthropological fieldwork. The genius lies in the presentation, not, I invented this chant, but this is what the authorities reported hearing. This technique, which we might call false documentation, pervades his approach to cult construction and reflects his deep engagement with how real religious movements were being documented, sensationalized, and misunderstood in his era. Lovecraft's relationship with scholarly authority was itself complex and revealing. He possessed genuine erudition in certain areas, colonial American history, 18th century literature, architectural styles, while in others, particularly non-Western religions and occult traditions, his knowledge was broad but shallow, derived from secondary sources rather than deep study. This actually served his artistic purposes remarkably well. A genuine expert in, say, Polynesian mythology would have been constrained by accuracy. Lovecraft, working from travelogues and sensationalist anthropological accounts, felt free to extract evocative details while discarding inconvenient complexities. His letters reveal an author consciously aware of this dynamic, one who occasionally expressed mild guilt about his appropriations, while simultaneously defending them as necessary for artistic effect. In a 1930 letter, he discusses reading about South American indigenous religions and immediately considering how their cosmological concepts might be repurposed for his fiction, acknowledging that what he would create would bear only superficial resemblance to the source material. This is not the approach of someone seeking to authentically represent real religious traditions, but neither is it the approach of someone inventing in a vacuum. It represents a third category, extractive synthesis, where real human religious expression becomes raw material for something entirely new and entirely fictional, yet which carries the psychological residue of genuine belief systems. The role of newspapers and periodicals in shaping Lovecraft's cult conceptions cannot be overstated. During the 1920s, American and British newspapers regularly featured sensationalized accounts of archaeological discoveries, anthropological expeditions, and supposed encounters with primitive or degenerate religious practices. Lovecraft was an avid reader of such accounts, clipping articles and referencing them in his correspondence. These newspaper stories provided him with exactly the kind of material he needed: fragmentary, sensational, stripped of nuance, and presented with an authoritative documentary veneer. When archaeologists discovered previously unknown civilizations in Central America, newspapers didn't simply report facts. They speculated wildly about lost cities, ancient cults, and the possibility that savage religions might persist in remote areas. Lovecraft absorbed this mode of presentation and replicated it in his fiction, creating newspaper accounts within his stories that mirror the breathless, pseudo-scientific tone of actual 1920s journalism. The result is a kind of double authentication. His fictional cults feel real, partly because they are presented in the same narrative mode as real cults were being presented to the reading public. This technique extends beyond simple mimicry. It represents Lovecraft's keen understanding of how authority is constructed through documentation, through the mere fact of something appearing in print with dates, locations, and official-sounding sources attached. His explicit statements about fabrication versus adaptation reveal a writer deeply concerned with what we might call atmospheric authenticity. In multiple letters, Lovecraft distinguishes between crude invention and convincing myth creation, arguing that the latter requires anchoring fictional elements in recognizable patterns drawn from actual human religious behavior. He cites The Golden Bough by James George Frazer, that massive comparative religion study published between 1890 and 1915, as particularly influential in teaching him the universal structures underlying diverse religious movements. From Frazer, Lovecraft absorbed the idea that certain religious patterns recur across cultures: sacrifice, cyclical return, the dying and reviving deity, the threshold between worlds, the sacred space where rules differ. These patterns, documented by Frazer across dozens of cultures, gave Lovecraft a toolkit of religiously resonant structures that he could deploy in fictional contexts. When his fictional cults practice blood sacrifice, maintain sacred spaces, or await cyclical returns of their deities, they are operating according to patterns Frazer identified in actual religious systems. This is not accident, but method, the conscious application of comparative religious scholarship to fictional world building. We must recognize here that Lovecraft was engaging in what amounts to literary anthropology, studying the grammar of religious expression in order to create new sentences that feel syntactically correct, even as they describe impossible theologies. The intersection of his personal prejudices with his cult research creates uncomfortable interpretive challenges that we cannot avoid addressing. Lovecraft's racism and xenophobia are extensively documented, and they profoundly shaped how he engaged with non-Western religious traditions. His letters reveal someone who found accounts of African, Asian, and indigenous American religious practices both fascinating and repulsive, viewing them through a lens of supposed racial degeneration. This meant that when he extracted elements from these traditions for his fiction, he was not seeking understanding or appreciation, but rather confirmation of his pre-existing beliefs about cultural hierarchy. His fictional cults are almost invariably associated with racial mixing, geographic isolation, and supposed degeneration from some imagined civilized norm. The Cthulhu cultists include Eskimos, mongrel Louisianians, and Pacific Islanders, precisely the populations Lovecraft viewed as racially other. The Innsmouth cultists are degraded New Englanders who have interbred with something non-human, a transparent metaphor for his anxieties about miscegenation. This cannot be separated from his cult creation because it was inseparable in his mind. His research into real religious traditions was filtered through a worldview that saw non-European religious expression as evidence of racial inferiority. Modern readers and scholars must therefore engage in a complex act of extraction, recognizing the genuine research and creative synthesis, while acknowledging the poisonous ideology that shaped how that research was interpreted and deployed. This complexity sets the stage for our deeper investigation into specific sources and influences, where we will see this dynamic playing out in granular detail across various religious traditions and occult movements that captured Lovecraft's attention. The intellectual landscape of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was saturated with what we might call occult revivalism, a widespread fascination with esoteric traditions, hidden knowledge, and alternative religious frameworks that challenged conventional Christianity. Lovecraft came of age during the height of this cultural moment, and while he personally rejected supernatural claims with materialist conviction, he could not avoid absorbing the vocabulary, structures, and anxieties that permeated this era's engagement with the occult. Theosophy, that syncretic movement founded by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky in 1875, had, by the 1920s, established lodges throughout the United States and Europe, disseminating ideas about hidden masters, lost civilizations, and cosmic hierarchies that would profoundly influence how Westerners imagined alternative spiritualities. Lovecraft explicitly mentions Theosophy in several letters, always with contempt for its claims, yet with clear awareness of its cultural penetration. The theosophical concept of root races, successive waves of human evolution guided by advanced beings, bears uncomfortable similarity to Lovecraft's own fictional framework of pre-human civilizations and cosmic entities that preceded and will succeed humanity. This is not to suggest Lovecraft was secretly influenced by Theosophy in any positive sense, but rather that he was working within the same cultural moment, responding to the same anxieties about human significance, and had access to the same vocabulary of cosmic hierarchy and ancient wisdom. The theosophical insistence that surface reality concealed deeper, more troubling truths, accessible only to initiates, created a template that Lovecraft would invert for horror purposes. Where Theosophy promised enlightenment through secret knowledge, Lovecraft promised madness. Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, presents a cosmology of vast temporal scales, of civilizations rising and falling across epochs incomprehensible to human reckoning, of beings who manipulate human development from behind the scenes. Lovecraft demonstrably knew of this text, referencing it dismissively in his correspondence, while simultaneously constructing fictional cosmologies that mirror its structural ambitions. The Secret Doctrine proposes that human history, as conventionally understood, represents merely surface phenomena, beneath which lies a deeper history of root races, Atlantean civilizations, and Lemurian epochs stretching back millions of years. Compare this to Lovecraft's fictional framework. The Old Ones who ruled Earth before humanity, the star-spawn of Cthulhu, who descended in Earth's Paleozoic era, the civilizations of Elder Things and Migo that predate human existence entirely. Both systems insist that conventional history is a lie of omission, that the true story of Earth involves non-human or pre-human intelligences, and that this knowledge has been preserved in fragmentary form by secret societies and occult traditions. The crucial difference lies in valuation. Theosophy presents this hidden history as spiritually elevating, while Lovecraft renders it as existentially devastating. Yet the structural similarity reveals shared cultural anxieties about historical knowledge, about the reliability of civilizational narratives, and about humanity's cosmic significance. We must pause here to recognize that Lovecraft was not creating in isolation, but was rather participating in and inverting a widespread cultural conversation about hidden knowledge and alternative histories. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, established in 1887, represented another manifestation of fin de siècle occult revival that existed within Lovecraft's awareness, if not his direct experience. This ceremonial magic order, which counted among its members William Butler Yeats, Aleister Crowley, and Arthur Machen, practiced elaborate rituals meant to invoke spiritual entities and develop magical consciousness through systematic study of Kabbalah, tarot, astrology, and Egyptian symbolism. Lovecraft expressed disdain for such organizations, viewing them as either deliberate frauds or the province of the psychologically disturbed. Yet his fictional cults often mirror their organizational structures with remarkable precision. The Golden Dawn emphasized hierarchical initiation, with members advancing through degrees as they mastered increasingly complex magical knowledge. Precisely the structure Lovecraft employs in his esoteric Order of Dagon, his various witch covens, and his scattered references to cult hierarchies where inner circles possess knowledge withheld from outer members. The Golden Dawn's elaborate ritual scripts, preserved in documents Lovecraft could have encountered, provided templates for how organized magical groups actually operated. Formal invocations, magical names, symbolic regalia, and the transformation of mundane spaces into sacred contexts through ritual procedure. When Lovecraft's cultists gather in queer ceremonies with specific ritual formulae, they are engaged in practices that mirror actual ceremonial magic traditions, even as the entities they invoke belong entirely to Lovecraft's imagination. This represents another instance of extractive synthesis, taking the form of real occult practice while replacing its content with cosmic horror. James George Fraser's The Golden Bough stands as perhaps the single most important anthropological text informing Lovecraft's cult conceptions. Published in multiple expanding editions between 1890 and 1915, eventually growing to 12 volumes, Fraser's comparative study attempted to identify universal patterns in religious practice across diverse cultures. Lovecraft references the Golden Bough repeatedly in his letters, and its influence permeates his fictional religious frameworks. Fraser's central thesis, that magic, religion, and science represent successive stages in human thought, and that beneath apparent cultural differences lie common psychological structures, gave Lovecraft both permission and methodology for creating fictional religions that felt anthropologically plausible. Fraser documented patterns of ritual kingship, sacrifice, fertility rites, and cyclical mythologies from cultures worldwide, arguing that these patterns reflected fundamental human responses to natural processes. Lovecraft absorbed this comparative method and applied it synthetically. If real religions across cultures share structural similarities, then a fictional religion constructed according to those same patterns should feel equally authentic. When his Cthulhu cult practices ritual sacrifice, when his witch covens gather at specific calendar points, when his cultists await cyclical returns of their deities, They are operating according to patterns Fraser identified as cross-culturally persistent. The scholarly apparatus Fraser employed, extensive footnotes, comparative charts, references to obscure ethnographic sources, also influenced Lovecraft's fictional documentation style. His creation of false bibliographies and pseudo-scholarly citations meant to give his inventions the weight of academic authority. Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Western Europe, published in 1921, proposed a controversial thesis that profoundly influenced interwar occult discourse and clearly impacted Lovecraft's conceptualization of persistent cults. Murray argued that the medieval and early modern witch trials had actually uncovered remnants of a pre-Christian fertility religion that survived in hidden form across Europe, and that the witches executed were genuine practitioners of this surviving pagan tradition rather than victims of mass hysteria. Modern scholarship has thoroughly discredited Murray's thesis, but in the 1920s and 1930s it circulated widely and was taken seriously by both popular and some academic audiences. Lovecraft references Murray's work in his letters and fiction, most explicitly in The Dreams in the Witch House, where he portrays colonial-era witch Kezia Mason as possessing genuine knowledge of non-Euclidean mathematics and interdimensional travel. Murray's framework provided Lovecraft with something enormously useful, a scholarly-sounding argument that secret religious traditions could persist for centuries beneath the surface of civilized society, their practices dismissed as superstition while actually containing dangerous knowledge. The idea that witch covens represented organized resistance to Christianity, that they preserved pre-Christian theologies, and that they met in specific locations for specific ritual purposes. All of this appears directly in Lovecraft's fiction, transformed from Murray's false anthropology into effective horror narrative structure. The survival of the cult, despite persecution and societal transformation, becomes a recurring Lovecraftian motif that owes clear debt to Murray's witch cult hypothesis. Newspaper sensationalism regarding exotic religious practices provided Lovecraft with continuous contemporary material that shaped his fictional cult portrayals. The 1920s and 1930s saw regular newspaper coverage of Thuggee, the hereditary criminal gangs of India, portrayed in British colonial discourse as death cult assassins, voodoo, sensationalized accounts from Haiti and American South, and various indigenous religious practices described in language designed to shock Western readers. These accounts were rarely anthropologically accurate and were always filtered through colonial and racist assumptions, presenting non-Western religions as threatening, primitive, and potentially involving human sacrifice or other extreme practices. Lovecraft consumed such accounts avidly, clipping newspaper stories and referencing them in letters as examples of genuine cult activity in the modern world. This newspaper discourse taught him several techniques he would deploy fictionally: the authoritative documentary tone, despite sensational content, the use of supposedly official sources, police reports, colonial administrators, missionaries, to validate extraordinary claims, and the geographic specificity that made distant horrors feel potentially real. When Inspector LaGrasse raids the Louisiana Bayou cult in The Call of Cthulhu, the narrative mimics exactly the tone of newspaper accounts describing police actions against voodoo practitioners in the American South. When Lovecraft describes Pacific Island cultists, he draws directly on travelogue and missionary accounts that portrayed Polynesian religious practices as degraded, violent, and sexually transgressive. We must recognize that Lovecraft's cults emerged not only from scholarly texts, but from the entire media ecosystem of his era, particularly the racist sensationalism that characterized popular journalism's treatment of non-Western religious traditions. Arthur Machen's 1894 novella, The Great God Pan, established literary precedents that profoundly influenced Lovecraft's approach to depicting survivalist cults and hidden religious traditions. Machen, whom Lovecraft acknowledged as a major influence, portrayed ancient nature worship persisting secretly into the modern era, with practitioners possessing genuine supernatural power and knowledge that scientific modernity had dismissed. Machen's framework, ancient gods never died but merely withdrew, their worship continuing in remote areas and among those willing to transgress civilized boundaries, appears repeatedly in Lovecraft's fiction with only superficial modification. The crucial element Machen contributed was literary rather than anthropological, the technique of suggesting vast religious frameworks through fragmentary revelation, allowing readers to glimpse pieces of a larger cultic structure without ever receiving complete explanation. Lovecraft absorbed this technique and deployed it systematically, creating fictional religious systems that feel comprehensive precisely because they are never fully explained. Machen also established the tradition of linking cult practice to sexual transgression and the production of monstrous offspring, which Lovecraft would develop extensively in stories like The Dunwich Horror and The Shadow over Innsmouth. The lineage from Machen to Lovecraft represents not merely influence, but the establishment of a literary tradition for depicting persistent paganism as horror rather than romance, as threat rather than nostalgia. This literary precedent matters because it demonstrates that Lovecraft was not simply inventing cult frameworks from anthropological reading, but was working within and extending an existing tradition of weird fiction that had already established conventions for how hidden religious traditions should be portrayed narratively. The early 20th century academic discourse around degenerate cults and racial theories of religious development provided Lovecraft with a pseudo-scientific framework that he both believed and exploited for fiction. Anthropological texts from this era frequently employed evolutionary models that ranked religions hierarchically, with Protestant Christianity representing the pinnacle of development and various primitive or savage religions representing earlier stages. This framework assumed that religious practices involving elaborate ritual, physical transformation, ecstatic states, or polytheism indicated cultural and racial inferiority. Lovecraft absorbed this model completely, and it shapes every fictional cult he portrays. They are almost universally associated with racial degeneration, geographic isolation, and reversion to supposedly primitive patterns. The cultists in his stories are rarely presented as sophisticated theologians, but rather as degraded individuals or groups who have abandoned civilized religion for something older and baser. This reflects not only Lovecraft's personal racism, but the broader academic consensus of his era, which provided scholarly vocabulary for essentially racist categorizations of religious practice. We cannot separate Lovecraft's cult creation from this intellectual context because it fundamentally shaped what he considered plausible, threatening, and horrifying about non-mainstream religious traditions. His genius lay in recognizing that this entire framework of religious hierarchy and degeneration could be inverted into cosmic horror. If the supposedly primitive cults were actually correct about cosmic reality, then civilized humanity's self-satisfied superiority becomes tragic delusion. This inversion transforms racist anthropology into existential horror, though it never quite escapes the problematic assumptions embedded in its source material. As we proceed to examine Lovecraft's specific linguistic and symbolic techniques, we will see these cultural and philosophical foundations manifesting in concrete textual strategies. Lovecraft's obsession with linguistic authenticity, or rather, with the convincing simulation of linguistic authenticity, represents one of his most sophisticated techniques for making fictional cults feel genuinely ancient. His letters reveal a writer acutely aware that names carry psychological weight, that certain phonetic combinations suggest antiquity or alienness, and that the appearance of linguistic scholarship could lend credibility to complete fabrications. In a 1930 letter to fellow writer Robert E. Howard, Lovecraft discusses at length his method for constructing entity names and cult terminology, explaining that he deliberately avoided easily pronounceable English phonetics in favor of consonant clusters and guttural sounds that would feel foreign to American readers. This was not random gibberish, but systematic construction based on his reading of actual non-European languages, particularly Arabic, various Semitic languages, and Polynesian tongues, whose phonetic structures he encountered through linguistic texts and travelogues. Lovecraft never achieved genuine fluency in any language besides English and a reading knowledge of Latin. Yet he possessed enough exposure to diverse linguistic systems to extract their most evocative surface features. The result is a created vocabulary that sounds authentic without being traceable to any actual language, a linguistic uncanny valley where readers sense pattern and structure without being able to identify the source. This technique serves his cult narratives perfectly, as it suggests that these religious traditions predate or exist outside familiar linguistic families, occupying a space that feels genuinely other rather than simply exotic. The phonetics of Cthulhu deserve extended consideration as they exemplify Lovecraft's linguistic methodology. In various letters, Lovecraft explained that the name should be approximated rather than definitively pronounced, describing it as containing sounds not producible by human vocal organs, but approximated by something like klul-hlu, with a guttural quality. This explanation itself performs important work. By claiming the name transcends human phonetics, Lovecraft transforms a linguistic invention into a theological statement about cosmic alienness. The spelling, with its unusual combination of consonants, the apostrophe suggesting a glottal stop or pause, and the non-standard capitalization, visually signals foreignness before the reader even attempts pronunciation. Scholars have traced possible influences. The Keith cluster resembles conventions in transliterating Arabic gutturals, while the U ending echoes Polynesian phonetics. Yet the combination belongs to no actual language, creating what we might call synthetic alienness, the suggestion of linguistic authenticity without actual linguistic heritage. When Lovecraft's cultists chant to Cthulhu, they are speaking a language that feels ancient and non-Western without being identifiable as Arabic, Polynesian, or any other real linguistic tradition. This serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It evades easy categorization. It prevents readers with linguistic knowledge from identifying borrowings, and it maintains the cosmic alienness that Lovecraft considers essential to his entity's nature. The name becomes a kind of linguistic Rorschach test, where readers project their associations with foreign or ancient sounds without being able to pin down specific references. R'lyeh, the sunken city where Cthulhu lies dreaming, demonstrates Lovecraft's strategic deployment of Polynesian toponymic patterns. Real Polynesian place names frequently feature glottal stops, represented by apostrophes in transliteration, repeated vowels, and consonant-vowel patterns that create a distinctive rhythm. Names like Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and Raiatea exemplify these patterns. Lovecraft read extensively about Pacific exploration, missionary accounts, and anthropological studies of Polynesian cultures, absorbing enough linguistic exposure to recognize these patterns even without formal training. R'lyeh follows Polynesian phonetic rules closely enough to sound plausible. The glottal stop after the initial consonant, the repeated vowel sounds, the relatively simple consonant-vowel structure. Yet no Polynesian language contains exactly this name, and Lovecraft's placement of R'lyeh in the South Pacific. He provides coordinates of 47 degrees 9's 126 degrees 43 TW in The Call of Cthulhu, a location in the remote Pacific Ocean, deliberately situates his fictional cult within geographic space associated with real Polynesian cultures. This represents extractive synthesis at the linguistic level, taking just enough authentic phonetic features to trigger recognition while inventing a specific name that belongs to no actual language. The technique creates a kind of linguistic authenticity that withstands casual scrutiny. Readers with passing familiarity with Polynesian names recognize familiar patterns, while those with deeper knowledge recognize the invention but can appreciate the craft involved in the simulation. The entity name Yog-Sothoth exemplifies Lovecraft's pseudo-Arabic construction technique, combining consonant clusters and syllabic structures that suggest Semitic language families without belonging to any actual Arabic, Hebrew, or Aramaic tradition. Arabic names frequently employ triconsonantal roots, guttural sounds, and specific vowel patterns that Lovecraft encountered through his reading of Arabian Nights translations and Orientalist literature. The Yog opening suggests a Hebrew influence. Compare Yahweh or various angelic names ending in L, while Sothoth creates a repetition effect common in magical names across various traditions. The hyphenation itself performs important work, suggesting either a compound construction, as in many Arabic names combining divine attributes, or transliteration convention for rendering sounds that don't map neatly onto English orthography. In his letters, Lovecraft discusses reading various magical grimoires and occult texts that freely invented ancient names using quasi-Hebrew and quasi-Arabic constructions, and he recognized that such names carried authority precisely because most readers couldn't verify their linguistic authenticity. Yog-Sothoth sounds like it could be an entity name from medieval grimoire tradition, placing it in a continuum with names like Baphomet or Belial that circulated in Western occult discourse. Yet it belongs to no actual tradition, instead synthesizing recognizable patterns into a new creation. This naming strategy serves Lovecraft's cosmic framework. His entities should feel ancient enough to have been worshipped across human history, yet alien enough to transcend any single human cultural tradition. The cultist chant, Punglui Mglwinaf Cthulhu R'lyeh Ugahnagl Ftagan, represents perhaps Lovecraft's most ambitious linguistic construction, combining multiple strategies to creates something that feels simultaneously grammatical and utterly alien. The chant appears in The Call of Cthulhu, with a provided translation. In his house at R'lyeh, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. The phonetic construction deliberately violates English phonotactic rules. The combinations of consonants without intervening vowels, mgulwanaf, waghanagol, cannot be produced easily by English speakers, creating a sense of linguistic strain. Yet the structure suggests actual syntax. We can identify what appears to be a locative phrase, in his house at R'lyeh, a subject, Cthulhu, and a predicate construction, waits dreaming. This grammatical shadow makes the chant feel like genuine language rather than random syllables, even as its phonetic construction resists easy pronunciation. Lovecraft described his inspiration as combining Welsh consonant clusters, which in written form often appeared daunting to English speakers, with the guttural qualities of Arabic and the alien quality of languages he considered maximally distant from Indo-European families. The result is a constructed language fragment that suggests vast, unknowable grammatical systems operating according to non-human logic. When cultists chant these words, they are not simply making noise, but engaging in linguistic acts that imply entire traditions of theological discourse, ritual formulas, and sacred grammar that exist beyond human linguistic capacity. This transforms language itself into a form of cosmic horror, the suggestion that there are modes of meaning-making that human vocal apparatus and cognitive structures can barely approximate. Lovecraft's deliberate use of linguistic principles to suggest antiquity extended beyond individual names to encompass entire systems of cult terminology. He understood that real ancient traditions employ specialized vocabulary, that religious communities develop technical language for describing their practices and beliefs, and that this specialized language serves as a marker of initiation and belonging. His fictional cults therefore possess not just names for their entities, but entire vocabularies. The Necronomicon as a book title, R'lyeh text as a textual tradition, the esoteric order of Dagon as an organizational name, Shoggoths and Deep Ones as taxonomic categories. Each of these terms follows similar construction principles: unusual but not impossible phonetics, vaguely classical or archaic morphology, and semantic ambiguity that suggests meanings extending beyond surface translation. The term Necronomicon, for instance, combines Greek roots, nekros for death, nomos for law or custom, and icon for image or book, in a construction that sounds scholarly while being grammatically questionable as actual Greek. Lovecraft was aware of this. He explicitly discusses in letters his decision to create a title that sounded like it could be Greek without worrying about grammatical correctness, recognizing that the appearance of classical learning would enhance the false grimoire's credibility. This linguistic sloppiness, disguised as erudition, actually serves his purposes better than genuine accuracy would, as it allows him to gesture towards scholarly traditions without being constrained by their actual rules. The strategic deployment of supposedly unpronounceable divine names reflects Lovecraft's engagement with genuine theological traditions across multiple cultures. Real religious systems frequently preserve divine names considered too sacred for casual pronunciation. The Jewish prohibition against speaking the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, provides the most familiar Western example, but similar prohibitions exist in various Islamic traditions regarding the 99 names of Allah, in Hindu traditions regarding certain mantric formulae, and in numerous indigenous traditions regarding sacred language. Lovecraft recognized that unpronounceability serves theological purposes. It maintains divine transcendence. It preserves initiatory boundaries between those who know and those who don't. And it suggests that ultimate reality exceeds human linguistic capacity. By claiming that names like Cthulhu and Azathoth cannot be properly pronounced by human vocal apparatus, Lovecraft imports this genuine theological principle into his fictional framework. The unpronounceability becomes evidence of cosmic alienness. These entities predate human language, exist beyond human conceptual frameworks, and can only be approximately referenced rather than definitively named. This represents a sophisticated appropriation of actual religious practice transformed into cosmic horror, where real traditions preserve divine mystery through linguistic restriction. Lovecraft uses linguistic restriction to emphasize absolute cosmic indifference to human existence. The entities don't withhold their true names out of holiness, but out of fundamental incommensurability with human cognitive and linguistic structures. Lovecraft's scholarly apparatus, his invention of bibliographies, citations, and textual histories, extends his linguistic construction into the realm of philological fiction. Real occult traditions are preserved in grimoires, transmitted through manuscript traditions, translated across languages, and surrounded by scholarly debates about authenticity and interpretation. Lovecraft recognized that simulating this textual ecology would enhance his cult's credibility, so he created false scholarly histories for his invented texts. The Necronomicon supposedly was written in Arabic as the Al-Azif by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred in Damascus around 730 CE, translated into Greek as Necronomicon by Theodorus Philetus in 950 CE, translated into Latin by Olaus Wormius in 1228, with various editions suppressed by religious authorities across centuries. This entirely fictional textual history mirrors actual grimoire histories. Consider the Key of Solomon, which claims Solomonic authorship but actually dates to medieval or Renaissance periods, or the Picatrix, an Arabic magical text translated into Latin in 13th century Spain. Lovecraft was constructing not just individual texts, but entire traditions of textual transmission, scholarly debate, and bibliographic mystery that parallel real occult literature. The technique creates multiple layers of authentication. The text itself claims ancient authorship. Later scholars supposedly debated its contents. Modern occultists supposedly seek surviving copies, and Lovecraft's fictional protagonists encounter fragments that correspond to these elaborate histories. This bibliographic fiction serves his cult narratives by suggesting that cultist knowledge has been preserved, debated, suppressed, and transmitted across centuries through textual means, exactly how real religious and occult traditions actually operate. The linguistic construction thus extends far beyond individual names to encompass entire systems of textual authority, scholarly authentication, and initiatory knowledge transmission that make his cults feel embedded in genuine historical and textual processes. As we turn to examine how Lovecraft constructed authentic feeling mythologies and narrative traditions, we will see these linguistic strategies manifesting in larger structural patterns that govern how his cults operate within their fictional worlds. The pseudo-documentary technique stands as Lovecraft's most effective tool for transforming pure invention into something that feels archaeologically recovered rather than literarily created. His mature fiction consistently employs what we might call the rhetoric of scholarship: footnotes, citations, bibliographic references, and academic qualifications that mirror the apparatus of genuine historical and anthropological research. The Call of Cthulhu, published in 1926, exemplifies this method with particular clarity. The story is framed as a manuscript left by the late Francis Wayland Thurston, who has compiled materials from his grand uncle's papers, which in turn reference police reports, newspaper accounts, academic presentations, and interviews with witnesses. This nested documentation creates layers of authentication, with each layer appearing to corroborate the others. The narrative never asks readers to simply trust the author's imagination, but instead presents itself as recovered evidence requiring interpretation. Lovecraft understood intuitively what modern narratologists have codified: that verisimilitude depends not on comprehensive explanation, but on the texture of documentation, on the accumulation of small authenticating details that make extraordinary claims feel empirically grounded. When Inspector Legras describes raiding the Louisiana swamp cult in 1907, the account includes specific dates, specific locations, specific numbers of participants arrested, and specific ritual objects confiscated. The granular specificity that characterizes actual police reports. When Professor Webb of Princeton presents his research on cult iconography at the 1908 meeting of the American Archaeological Society, Lovecraft provides the institutional affiliation, the year, the venue, and the scholarly context that would surround genuine academic presentations. None of this happened, yet the documentation reads as though it could be verified if one simply had access to the right archives. This technique transforms readers from passive consumers of fiction into something resembling investigators, sifting evidence and drawing conclusions from accumulated testimony. The structure of real cult organizations, their hierarchies, initiation practices, and knowledge stratification provided Lovecraft with templates he could adapt for fictional purposes while maintaining sociological plausibility. Actual secret societies and religious organizations typically organize themselves through graduated levels of membership, with outer circles receiving partial doctrine, while inner circles possess fuller knowledge, considered too dangerous, too sacred, or too philosophically challenging for novices. Freemasonry, which Lovecraft knew about through cultural osmosis, if not direct study, employs exactly this structure across its degree system. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn organized members into 10 grades corresponding to Kabbalistic Sephiroth, with complex initiation rituals marking passage between levels. Even conventional religious organizations employ versions of this pattern. Catholic priesthood requires years of seminary training before ordination. Buddhist monastic traditions involve progressive stages of teaching and practice, and numerous indigenous traditions restrict certain knowledge to elders or specifically initiated members. Lovecraft recognized that this organizational pattern serves multiple psychological and social functions. It creates investment through graduated commitment. It maintains group cohesion through shared secrets. It provides clear authority structures, and it allows dangerous or challenging ideas to be introduced progressively rather than all at once. His fictional cults replicate these patterns with remarkable consistency. The esoteric order of Dagon in The Shadow over Innsmouth clearly operates through hierarchical initiation, with townspeople born into the cult receiving fuller revelation as they age and demonstrate commitment. The witch covens in The Dreams in the Witch House maintain inner circles who possess mathematical knowledge withheld from ordinary members. Even the scattered Cthulhu cultists appear to operate through networks where some members understand the full cosmological implications, while others simply perform rituals they've been taught. This organizational realism makes the cults feel like actual human institutions rather than authorial conveniences. Historical depth, the suggestion that these cults extend backward through centuries or millennia, represents another crucial element in Lovecraft's myth-building strategy. Real religions do not appear fully formed, but develop through historical processes, accumulating traditions, fragmenting into sects, adapting to changing circumstances, and leaving archaeological traces. Lovecraft understood that credible cult fiction must suggest similar historical processes rather than presenting cults as static or recently invented. Consider how he handles the Cthulhu cult's history. References suggest worship dating back to prehistoric Pacific cultures, transmission through various Asian and Middle Eastern civilizations, survival in isolated communities globally, and periodic resurgences when the stars are right. This multi-millennial scope, while entirely fictional, mirrors how real religious traditions actually persist, through textual transmission, through isolated communities maintaining old practices, through periodic revivals of interest, and through syncretistic blending with other traditions. The esoteric order of Dagon supposedly traces its origins to pre-human deep ones, but manifests historically through Captain Obed Marsh's encounter with Polynesian cultists in the 1840s, his importation of the cult to Innsmouth, and its subsequent entrenchment over 3 generations. This represents historical thinking applied to fictional religion. The cult has a founding moment, a period of growth, mechanisms of transmission, and intergenerational persistence. Lovecraft never simply declares, "This cult has always existed," but instead provides genealogies, transmission histories, and evolutionary processes that explain how ancient knowledge reaches modern practitioners. The technique grounds cosmic horror in human historical experience, making the impossible feel like it has genuinely unfolded across documented time. Geographic specificity serves as another authenticating mechanism, anchoring fictional cults in real locations where readers could theoretically go and investigate. Lovecraft rarely set his cult activities in vague or unnamed locations, but instead provided precise geographic coordinates, real city names, and identifiable regional characteristics. The Cthulhu cult's sunken city, Aurelia, supposedly lies at 47 Flugnines, 126 W in the South Pacific, specific enough that oceanographers could theoretically search for it. The esoteric order of Dagon operates in Innsmouth, Massachusetts, a fictional town that Lovecraft situates precisely in relation to actual Massachusetts geography, describing its location relative to Newburyport, Ipswich, and other real communities. The Louisiana swamp cult La Grasse raids occurs in specific bayou regions that correspond to actual geographic features of southern Louisiana. This geographic precision serves multiple purposes simultaneously. First, it grounds the fantastic in the mundane. Readers familiar with Massachusetts coastline or Louisiana bayous can visualize the settings, making the extraordinary events feel like they're intruding into recognizable reality. Second, it invites verification. The specificity suggests that dedicated researchers could investigate these locations, even though they would obviously find nothing because the cults are fictional. Third, it demonstrates authorial research. Lovecraft clearly knew enough about these regions' geography, history, and culture to situate his fiction convincingly within them. The technique mirrors how actual anthropological and historical accounts document religious practices by providing precise locations, dates, and geographic contexts that allow readers to situate claims within verifiable frameworks. The collaborative aspect of Lovecraft's mythos building deserves particular attention, as it represents a unique authentication strategy that few other horror writers have employed so systematically. Beginning in the mid-1920s, Lovecraft encouraged fellow writers in his circle, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Robert Bloch, Frank Belknap Long, and others, to reference his invented entities, books, and cults in their own fiction, while he reciprocally referenced their inventions in his stories. This created a kind of literary corroboration effect. When multiple authors, writing in different styles for different publications, all reference the Necronomicon or mention Cthulhu, it creates the illusion that these elements exist independently of any single author's imagination. Readers encountering Smith's references to Tsathoggua and then finding Lovecraft's references to the same entity in an unrelated story might reasonably conclude that both authors were drawing on some common source rather than collaboratively inventing. This technique mimics how real mythologies develop through multiple tellings by different storytellers, through variations that suggest a common traditional core, through cross-references that imply broader cultural knowledge. Lovecraft explicitly discusses this strategy in his letters, describing it as a way to make the invented mythology feel traditional rather than personal. The collaborative approach also allowed for productive ambiguity. When different authors provided slightly different accounts of the same entity or cult, it created the impression of diverse sources reporting on a common phenomenon, exactly how actual religious traditions appear in the historical record, where different chroniclers provide varying accounts. This represents meta-textual authentication, using the structure of literary production itself to suggest that fictional elements possess independent existence. Lovecraft's letters discussing the shared universe approach reveal self-conscious craft rather than delusion or mystification. In a 1930 letter to Robert E. Howard, he explicitly describes the Cthulhu mythos as a background of evil verisimilitude that gains strength through repetition and cross-reference, acknowledging that it is entirely invented while discussing techniques for making it feel discovered. He compares the process to how medieval scholars treated classical mythology as a body of traditional material that individual authors could draw upon, adapt, and expand while maintaining consistency with the broader tradition. This is fundamentally different from claiming the mythology is real. Lovecraft is instead discussing narrative strategies for creating fictional traditions that possess the psychological weight of real ones. He distinguishes between crude invention, where authors simply make things up without regard for consistency, and myth building, where authors collaborate to create coherent fictional traditions with internal consistency, historical depth, and the appearance of having been transmitted across time. The distinction matters because it reveals Lovecraft's sophisticated understanding of how mythologies function psychologically and culturally. They feel real not because they are comprehensive, but because they are traditional, referenced across multiple sources, and possessed of the fragmentary quality that comes from transmission across time and translation across languages. The deliberate blurring between researched and invented material represents perhaps Lovecraft's most ethically complicated technique. He rarely explicitly told readers which elements were fictional and which were drawn from actual sources, allowing them to blend in reader consciousness. The Necronomicon provides the clearest example. Lovecraft invented it entirely, yet he discussed it in his fiction with such bibliographic specificity, providing its author, composition date, translation history, and surviving copies, that readers regularly believed it was a real grimoire he had researched. Libraries received requests for it, occult bookstores sought copies, and later writers treated it as though it genuinely existed in rare book collections. Lovecraft was aware this was happening and expressed ambivalence about it in his letters, sometimes finding it amusing and sometimes concerned that readers were confusing his fiction with scholarship. This blurring served his artistic purposes perfectly. If readers couldn't distinguish what was real from what was invented, then the invented material gained the psychological weight of the real. Yet it also created problems. It contributed to misinformation about actual occult traditions. It allowed readers to attribute genuine historical practices to Lovecraft's imagination, and it made serious engagement with his work more difficult because scholars had to constantly sort fiction from research. We must recognize this as a deliberate artistic choice rather than accidental confusion. Lovecraft wanted the blurring, cultivated it through specific techniques, and understood that it enhanced the cosmic horror effect he sought to create. The technique acknowledges something profound about how humans engage with narrative. We struggle to maintain clear boundaries between fiction and reality when fiction is presented with sufficient documentary apparatus. Lovecraft's awareness that effective lies contain fragments of truth manifests throughout his cult construction. He never created purely fantastic cults with no grounding in human religious behavior, but instead built fictional structures on foundations of actual religious patterns, actual human psychology, and actual historical precedents. The blood sacrifice in The Call of Cthulhu is fictional, but blood sacrifice exists in numerous real religious traditions, and Lovecraft had read about it extensively. The witch coven in The Dreams in the Witch House is fictional, but witch trial transcripts from Salem and Europe provided him with detailed accounts of how covens supposedly operated. The Deep One hybrids in The Shadow over Innsmouth are fictional, but transformation narratives and human divine offspring appear across numerous mythologies that Lovecraft had studied. By anchoring his inventions in real patterns, he ensured that readers' knowledge of actual religion would activate when encountering his fiction, creating resonance rather than dissonance. This technique explains why his cults feel more authentic than those created by writers working purely from imagination. They are not purely imagined, but rather synthetically constructed from fragments of genuine human religious experience, rearranged into new configurations that serve cosmic horror purposes. The fragments provide authentication, while the rearrangement provides novelty, resulting in something that feels simultaneously ancient and unprecedented. As we turn to examining the philosophical and thematic elements that govern how these cults function within Lovecraft's cosmology, we will see how this foundation of documentary technique and synthetic authenticity supports his broader project of rendering cosmic indifference narratively and existentially devastating. The survival cult model, religious traditions that persist in degraded or hidden form across vast temporal spans, provided Lovecraft with a framework that combined anthropological plausibility with cosmic horror potential. Early 20th century anthropology frequently discussed survivals, cultural practices, or beliefs that supposedly persisted from earlier evolutionary stages of human development, continuing in isolated communities or as folk customs long after their original context had disappeared. James Frazer's The Golden Bough catalogued hundreds of such survivals, arguing that contemporary European folk practices preserved fragments of pre-Christian paganism, whose theological meaning had been forgotten even as the ritual forms persisted. Margaret Murray extended this concept controversially, arguing that medieval witch trials had uncovered actual survival cults practicing pre-Christian religions. Lovecraft absorbed this framework and transformed it into something far more disturbing. What if the survivals were not merely remnants of human religious history, but traces of pre-human worship, religions established by entities that predated humanity entirely? This inversion transforms the anthropological concept from neutral observation into cosmic horror. The cults in his fiction are not human traditions that have endured, but rather non-human or transhuman traditions that humans have stumbled into, adopted, or been corrupted by. When Pacific Islanders worship Cthulhu, they are not inventing a deity, but maintaining worship established millions of years ago by the star-spawn themselves. When New England witch covens serve Shub-Niggurath, they are not creating new practices, but preserving rituals that predate human civilization. This suggests that human religious impulses do not originate autonomously, but represent our species' unfortunate contact with cosmic realities that regard us with supreme indifference. The survival cult model thus becomes a mechanism for rendering human religiosity itself as a kind of cosmic contamination rather than autonomous spiritual development. Cosmic indifference stands as the central theological principle Lovecraft extracted from his reading in comparative religion and redeployed as existential horror. Traditional Western theology, particularly Christianity, posits a universe fundamentally concerned with human moral and spiritual development, where divine attention focuses on human salvation or damnation. Lovecraft encountered through his anthropological reading alternative theological frameworks, animist traditions where spirits occupy natural phenomena without particular interest in human welfare, polytheistic systems where gods pursue their own agendas with humans as incidental beneficiaries or victims, and philosophical systems like Buddhism that describe cosmic processes fundamentally indifferent to individual human desires. He recognized that these non-Western frameworks, when pushed to their logical extremes, produce profound existential anxiety in readers raised within teleological Western traditions. His fictional cults worship entities that do not love, do not judge, do not promise salvation, and do not even consistently notice humanity's existence. Cthulhu lies dreaming in Aurelia, not because humans imprisoned him there, and not because he is waiting to reward his faithful, but simply because the cosmic cycles have temporarily placed him in that state. Human worship is irrelevant to his existence, though it may marginally facilitate his eventual rising. Azathoth, the blind idiot god at the center of infinity, remains utterly unaware of the cults that supposedly serve him, their worship as meaningless as the buzzing of insects. This represents the complete inversion of conventional religious logic. Worship offered to entities incapable of caring transforms religious devotion from meaningful relationship into futile gesture, from covenant into delusion. The cosmic indifference principle renders human religious striving as simultaneously inevitable. We are driven to worship by psychological need, and meaningless. The objects of worship regard us with less interest than we regard microorganisms. The inversion of Christian teleology appears consistently throughout Lovecraft's cult structures, where worship focuses not on achieving salvation, but on facilitating inevitable doom. Christianity and its Islamic and Jewish cousins promise progression toward divine purpose, whether individual salvation or collective messianic age, where history moves toward meaningful culmination. Lovecraft's cults worship the exact opposite, entities whose return or awakening will bring human extinction or enslavement, cosmic events that will render human civilization and consciousness irrelevant. The Cthulhu cultists explicitly await their deity's rising, which will bring madness and death to most of humanity. The servants of Nyarlathotep facilitate the crawling chaos that will dissolve civilizational structures. The worshippers in the Dunwich Horror seek to open gates through which the old ones will return to reclaim Earth. In every case, the cultists are not working toward salvation, but toward catastrophe, not seeking reward, but embracing annihilation. This seems psychologically implausible until we recognize that Lovecraft is drawing on actual religious patterns. Apocalyptic movements throughout history have welcomed destruction they believed would bring transformation. Death cults have existed in various cultures, and numerous religious traditions contain elements of cosmic dissolution or cyclical destruction. Lovecraft simply removes the transformation promise. His cults welcome destruction that brings no renewal, death that offers no rebirth, apocalypse that concludes nothing but human relevance. The psychological question becomes, why would anyone worship such entities? Lovecraft provides several answers across his fiction. Inherited tradition. They worship because their families always have. Direct revelation. They have glimpsed cosmic truth and cannot unknow it. Aesthetic compulsion. They find cosmic horror more intellectually honest than comforting falsehoods. Or simple madness. Contact with cosmic reality breaks human sanity. Each answer suggests that cult membership represents not freely chosen faith, but psychological or social necessity. Cyclical time versus linear time represents another philosophical element Lovecraft extracted from non-Western cosmologies and deployed for horror effect. Western religious traditions, particularly Christianity, operate according to linear time: creation, fall, redemption, judgment, with each event occurring once in unrepeatable sequence, moving toward definitive conclusion. Hindu and Buddhist traditions, by contrast, can see vast cosmic cycles, yugas, kalpas, where universes emerge, develop, dissolve, and re-emerge in endless succession without ultimate destination. Lovecraft read about these cyclical cosmologies and recognized their potential for cosmic horror. If time is cyclical rather than linear, then human history and human significance become mere fluctuations in incomprehensible cosmic rhythms. His cults worship according to cycles, when the stars are right, when specific astronomical alignments recur, when cosmic cycles complete their rotations. Cthulhu's cult awaits his rising, which depends not on moral conditions or human readiness, but on astronomical and geological cycles, utterly indifferent to human timeframes. The cult's liturgy, that is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die, explicitly invokes temporal scales where human concepts of life and death become meaningless. This cyclical framework renders human religious striving absurd. The cultists cannot hasten or prevent the cosmic cycles, only align themselves with inevitable processes. Their worship becomes less petition, asking for divine favor, and more preparation, readying themselves for unavoidable transformation. The implication extends beyond fiction. If cosmic reality actually operates according to cycles rather than teleology, then all human notions of progress, purpose, and historical meaning dissolve into temporary fluctuations within incomprehensible larger patterns. The dream cult interface exploits genuine mystical traditions' emphasis on altered states while inverting their promised revelations. Real religious traditions across cultures employ dreams, visions, trance states, and other altered consciousness to access divine knowledge or spiritual realms. Shamanic traditions journey to spirit worlds. Mystical traditions seek unio mystica. Contemplative traditions pursue enlightenment through meditation. Lovecraft read accounts of these practices with fascination, recognizing that altered states provide psychological explanations for religious experience that materialists like himself could accept as brain states, while religious practitioners interpret as genuine contact with transcendent reality. His fictional cults frequently operate through dreams and visions. Cthulhu calls to sensitive individuals through dreams, transmitting imagery and psychic impressions that recruit them to his worship. The witch Kezia Mason, in The Dreams in the Witch House, conducts her cult activities primarily through dream manipulation, drawing protagonist Walter Gilman into ritual participation while he believes himself asleep. The dreamlands in Lovecraft's interconnected stories represent an entire dimension accessible through sleep, where ancient gods and their cults maintain existence parallel to waking reality. This dream cult connection serves multiple purposes. It provides psychological plausibility. Cult members might believe themselves dreaming rather than genuinely worshipping. It creates ambiguity about what is real versus hallucinated, and it suggests that cosmic horror operates at the level of consciousness itself, rather than requiring physical manifestation. The technique acknowledges something profound about religious psychology. Visionary experience feels absolutely convincing to the experiencer, regardless of external verification, making dreams an ideal vector for recruiting cultists who cannot be convinced through rational argument, but can be overwhelmed by direct psychic experience. Forbidden mathematics and sacred geometry echo Pythagorean and Kabbalistic number mysticism, while transforming them into vectors of madness rather than enlightenment. Real esoteric traditions have long maintained that mathematical relationships reveal divine order. Pythagorean mysticism held that numerical ratios govern cosmic harmony. Kabbalistic gematria sought divine names through numerical values of letters. Sacred geometry traditions found spiritual significance in specific proportions and forms. Lovecraft encountered these traditions through his reading and recognized that mathematics, being abstract and non-intuitive, could plausibly contain knowledge dangerous to human sanity. His witch cults possess mathematical knowledge about non-Euclidean geometries that allow access to other dimensions. His cultists use astronomical calculations to determine when the stars are right, and his entities exist in mathematical relationships to reality that human consciousness cannot properly conceptualize. In The Dreams in the Witch House, Kezia Mason's cult knowledge explicitly involves higher mathematics that Walter Gilman, a mathematics student, recognizes as legitimate but sanity-destroying. The cult does not worship through feeling or faith, but through calculation, through determining the precise angles and times when reality's structure permits interdimensional contact. This represents Lovecraft's materialist horror at its most refined. The universe operates according to mathematical laws, but those laws, fully understood, are incompatible with human consciousness and well-being. The cultists who possess this mathematical knowledge have chosen understanding over sanity, cosmic truth over human flourishing, revealing the terrible possibility that intellectual honesty might be psychologically unbearable. The materialist horror underlying Lovecraft's cult theology deserves careful attention. His cults worship entities that are physically real rather than metaphorical, making cosmic horror a material rather than spiritual problem. Traditional religion typically conceives deities as spiritual beings whose reality transcends physical verification, requiring faith precisely because they cannot be empirically demonstrated. Lovecraft's entities are material. Cthulhu physically exists in a sunken city. The deep ones are biological organisms that reproduce sexually with humans. The Mygo are corporeal aliens with technological civilizations. This materiality transforms worship from faith-based relationship to acknowledgement of physical fact. The cultists are not believing in Cthulhu, despite lack of evidence, but maintaining traditions based on actual past encounters, physical artifacts, and biological heritage. The Innsmouth cultists worship Dagon because they literally descend from Deep One hybrids, their devotion grounded in genetic reality rather than spiritual choice. This materialist framework makes the cosmic horror inescapable. There is no comforting possibility that the entities are metaphorical, psychological projections, or spiritual beings whose existence depends on faith. They are physical realities whose existence is independent of human belief, making human denial or disbelief utterly irrelevant. The cult serves not to create or sustain the entity through worship, but to prepare humans for physical contact with realities that would otherwise annihilate human sanity through their mere factual existence. This is Lovecraft's ultimate horror, that the universe actually contains what the cults describe, and all human philosophy, science, and religion that denies these realities is not heroic rationalism but tragic ignorance. As we examine specific entities that cults worship and the traditions surrounding them, we will see how these philosophical principles manifest in concrete narrative forms. The Cthulhu cultists represent Lovecraft's most fully developed example of the Pacific death cult model, drawn directly from sensationalist anthropology and colonial-era accounts of savage religious practices. In The Call of Cthulhu, published in 1926, Inspector Legras encounters a Louisiana Bayou cult whose members, described with Lovecraft's characteristic racist terminology as mongrels and degenerates, have been practicing rituals involving human sacrifice, orgiastic dancing, and chanting in an unknown language. The cult's mythology centers on waiting for the stars to align properly so that Cthulhu can rise from his sunken city, Ardea, and reclaim dominion over Earth, an event that will liberate cultists into a world beyond conventional morality or law. Lovecraft explicitly modeled this on accounts he had read of supposed Polynesian death cults, Thuggee assassin traditions in India, and sensationalized reports of voodoo practices in Haiti and the American South. The cult exhibits several characteristics Lovecraft extracted from these sources: geographic isolation, the Louisiana swamps; racial otherness, the cultists are consistently described as non-white or racially mixed; devotion to entities demanding blood sacrifice; and social organization operating outside civilized legal structures. What makes the Cthulhu cult particularly effective is its global distribution. Lovecraft describes similar worship occurring simultaneously in Pacific Islands, Greenland, Arabian deserts, and Louisiana bayous, suggesting that the cult represents not isolated aberration but persistent global tradition. This worldwide distribution mirrors how colonial anthropology discussed various primitive practices, finding supposed similarities across geographically distant cultures and interpreting these similarities as evidence of racial kinship or ancient diffusion. Lovecraft inverts this. The global distribution proves not common human heritage, but common contact with Cthulhu's influence, which has corrupted diverse human populations independently. The cult thus becomes evidence that cosmic horror is not culturally specific, but represents objective reality that different human groups have independently encountered. The esoteric order of Dagon synthesizes maritime religious traditions with New England historical resonance, creating Lovecraft's most geographically and culturally specific cult. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, written in 1931, the order functions as the town's dominant religious and social institution, operating openly despite its worship of non-human entities and its facilitation of human deep one interbreeding. Lovecraft drew inspiration from multiple sources for this cult: Phoenician and Philistine worship of Dagon, a genuine ancient Near Eastern deity associated with fish and grain; New England maritime culture, with its economic dependence on fishing, and accounts of isolated religious communities that had diverged from mainstream Christianity. The cult's founder, Captain Obed Marsh, supposedly learned of the Deep Ones during trading voyages to unspecified Pacific islands in the 1840s, bringing back both knowledge and eventually actual Deep One contact to Innsmouth. This foundation narrative mirrors actual New England history, where maritime trade regularly exposed New Englanders to diverse religious traditions, sometimes resulting in syncretistic practices or heterodox beliefs. The order's structure reflects New England church organization: formal membership, meeting houses, clear hierarchy, and integration with civic authority. By the time the story takes place in the 1920s, the order has effectively become Innsmouth's established church, with cultists controlling local government, business, and social institutions. This represents Lovecraft's most sustained examination of what happens when a cult achieves complete social dominance rather than operating as persecuted minority. It becomes indistinguishable from conventional religion in its social functions, differing only in the cosmic horror of what it actually worships. The esoteric order demonstrates that cult organization follows predictable human patterns regardless of what entities are worshipped, suggesting that social structure matters more than theological content in determining how religious communities operate. The Starry Wisdom Church represents Lovecraft's synthesis of American religious innovation with cosmic horror theology, drawing on the historical prominence of new religious movements in American culture. Introduced in The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, the church supposedly operated in Providence, Rhode Island during the 1840s through 1870s, worshipping Nyarlathotep through use of an otherworldly artifact called the Shining Trapezohedron. Lovecraft was clearly drawing on Rhode Island's actual history of religious experimentation. The colony was founded as a haven for religious dissenters, and Providence throughout the 19th century saw emergence of spiritualist societies, Millerite apocalyptic movements, and various utopian religious communities. The Starry Wisdom Church fits this historical pattern. It appears as another new religious movement, promising cosmic knowledge to initiates, distinguished from its historical contemporaries only by the fact that its cosmic knowledge is genuine and catastrophic. The church's organizational structure mirrors American religious voluntarism, formal incorporation, property ownership, public worship spaces, and hierarchical leadership. Lovecraft describes the church's meeting hall as resembling conventional Protestant churches architecturally, with the key difference being interior modifications to accommodate the shining trapezohedron and the requirement that worship occur in complete darkness. This architectural detail reveals Lovecraft's technique. Start with familiar religious forms, then introduce specific variations that mark the organization as genuinely cultist rather than merely heterodox. The church's eventual suppression by Providence authorities in the 1870s, following mysterious disappearances and deaths, mirrors actual 19th century conflicts between new religious movements and civil authorities, though Lovecraft characteristically makes the authorities' concerns entirely justified rather than representing religious persecution. The Starry Wisdom Church thus demonstrates how cosmic horror cults could operate within American religious pluralism, appearing superficially similar to legitimate religious innovation, while actually facilitating contact with entities that should remain unknown. The cult of Shub-Niggurath exemplifies Lovecraft's appropriation and corruption of fertility cult traditions, transforming agricultural and reproductive rituals into cosmic horror worship. Shub-Niggurath, called the Black Goat of the Woods with 1,000 young, appears throughout Lovecraft's fiction and that of his circle as an entity associated with fecundity, forest wilderness, and monstrous reproduction. The cult surrounding this entity draws directly on European witch trial testimony about sabbats in forest clearings where witches supposedly worshipped the devil, often described as appearing in goat form, engaged in sexual rituals, and performed acts meant to ensure crop fertility or livestock fecundity. Lovecraft had read trial transcripts and scholarly analyses of European witch trials, absorbing their descriptions of midnight gatherings, animal sacrifice, ritual dancing, and the presence of a male goat figure presiding over ceremonies. His Shub-Niggurath cult simply makes these trial testimonies literally true, while amplifying their cosmic scope. The goat figure is not the devil, but an entity whose fecundity spans planetary scales, whose 1,000 young are monstrous spawn rather than human children, and whose worship connects not to Christian heresy, but to pre-human chthonic forces. The cult typically operates in remote forest regions, maintaining the geographic isolation characteristic of Lovecraft's fictional cults, while specifically linking worship to wilderness spaces that resist civilizational control. This wilderness association carries multiple meanings. It suggests that cosmic horror persists where human ordering fails. It links the cult to supposedly primitive nature worship, and it provides narrative justification for the cult's persistence despite modern civilization. The Shub-Niggurath cult also frequently involves female cultists and reproductive themes, allowing Lovecraft to deploy his anxieties about female sexuality and reproduction while ostensibly just adapting historical witch cult patterns. The result is a cult that feels historically grounded. Readers familiar with European witch trial history recognize the patterns, while actually describing something far more cosmically disturbing than historical witch trials ever uncovered. Nyarlathotep's many cults demonstrate Lovecraft's technique of creating entities that adapt their worship structures to different cultural contexts, functioning as cosmic chameleons who manifest differently across human cultures. Unlike Cthulhu or Azathoth, who remain relatively consistent across their appearances, Nyarlathotep manifests in numerous forms. The Black Man of European witch tradition, the Haunter of the Dark, worshipped by the Starry Wisdom Church, a pharaoh-like figure in Egypt, a howling chaos in the Dreamlands, and various other avatars described across Lovecraft's fiction. This multiplicity allows Lovecraft to explore how a single cosmic entity might generate diverse cult traditions that appear unrelated superficially, but serve the same underlying force. The technique mirrors actual comparative religion scholarship that sought to identify common divine figures beneath culturally specific names and attributes, Zeus, Jupiter, and Odin as variations of an Indo-European sky father deity, for instance. Lovecraft inverts this. Where scholars sought to demonstrate common human religious patterns, Lovecraft suggests that apparently diverse human religious traditions might represent different encounters with the same cosmic horror. Each Nyarlathotep cult reflects the cultural context in which it operates. The European witches see him as the devil because that fits their Christian framework. The Starry Wisdom Church sees him as an alien intelligence because that fits their 19th century context of scientific materialism. Ancient Egyptians see him as a dark pharaoh because that fits their theological framework of divine kingship. This demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how religious experience is culturally mediated. The same objective reality in Lovecraft's fiction, Nyarlathotep's actual existence, generates different subjective interpretations depending on the conceptual frameworks available to worshippers. The implication becomes quietly disturbing. If cosmic entities can generate such diverse religious responses, perhaps actual human religious diversity reflects not cultural creativity, but different cultural interpretations of objective cosmic horrors that have contacted humanity across history. The distinction between organized cults and isolated worshippers reveals Lovecraft's nuanced understanding of religious sociology. Most prominently, his fiction includes both formal cult organizations, Esoteric Order of Dagon, Starry Wisdom Church, and isolated individuals or small groups who worship independently, the Louisiana Bayou cultists, various sorcerers, and witches. This distinction mirrors actual religious diversity. Some traditions require institutional structures and formal organization, while others operate through individual practice or small, informal groups. The organized cults in Lovecraft's fiction typically demonstrate several characteristics: public presence, even if their true nature is hidden; property ownership; formal membership processes; hierarchical leadership; and integration with broader social structures. The isolated worshippers lack these institutional features, but often possess deeper cosmic knowledge, as if institutional religion inevitably compromises purity of revelation through social accommodation. Old Castro, the elderly cultist who provides Inspector Legrasse with background on Cthulhu worship in The Call of Cthulhu, represents this type, an individual maintaining tradition independent of organizational structure, whose knowledge comes from family, heritage, rather than institutional training. This reflects Lovecraft's ambivalence about religious institution. Organized religion achieves social influence and persistence across generations, but necessarily compromises radical cosmic truths to maintain social acceptability, while isolated practitioners preserve dangerous knowledge at the cost of social marginalization and limited influence. The pattern also allows narrative flexibility. Organized cults provide social and institutional horror, the corruption of entire communities, while isolated worshippers provide individual psychological horror, the lone sorcerer pursuing forbidden knowledge despite personal cost. The question of how cultists acquire their knowledge, whether through inheritance, revelation, or discovery, represents a key variable in Lovecraft's cult portrayals that he adapted from actual religious transmission patterns. Some cultists inherit their worship. The Marsh family in Innsmouth passes Deep One worship across generations through biological descent and family tradition. Cultists are born into worship rather than converting to it. Other cultists receive direct revelation. Sensitive individuals receive dreams from Cthulhu that teach them chants and mythology they could not have learned conventionally, representing unmediated divine contact. Still others discover cult knowledge through research. Scholars who read forbidden texts, archaeologists who excavate cult artifacts, or investigators who piece together fragmentary evidence until they understand enough to become cultists themselves. Each transmission method appears in real religious traditions, inherited tradition, Judaism's emphasis on lineage, revelatory contact, Muhammad's reception of the Quran, Joseph Smith's golden plates, and discovered knowledge, converts through intellectual study. By varying transmission methods across different cults, Lovecraft creates diversity that mirrors actual religious complexity, while suggesting that multiple pathways lead to the same cosmic horror. The inherited tradition model suggests that cult knowledge functions like genetic trait, transmitted biologically or culturally across generations. The revelatory model suggests that cosmic entities actively recruit worshippers by transmitting knowledge directly. The discovery model suggests that sufficient investigation inevitably uncovers cosmic truths that conventional civilization tries to suppress. Each model carries different implications about human agency and cosmic structure, and Lovecraft deliberately employs all three to avoid suggesting any single mechanism governs cult formation. The cosmic call that draws individuals into cult membership represents Lovecraft's most psychologically sophisticated cult recruitment mechanism, one that deliberately maintains ambiguity between supernatural influence and natural psychological vulnerability. Sensitive individuals, artists, dreamers, those with particular neurological or psychological characteristics, report receiving impressions, images, or compulsions from cosmic entities, particularly Cthulhu. These experiences could be interpreted either as genuine psychic contact with non-human intelligence or as psychological phenomena, hallucinations, obsessions, dream content, that cultists misinterpret as external contact. Lovecraft carefully refuses to resolve this ambiguity in most of his stories. We never definitively learn whether the call is objectively real or subjectively experienced. This ambiguity serves multiple purposes. It maintains cosmic horror by refusing comfortable explanations. It reflects actual religious psychology, where believers experience divine contact that skeptics interpret as psychological phenomena, and it suggests that the distinction between objective and subjective might be meaningless at cosmic scales. The core typically manifests through dreams, artistic inspiration, or sudden obsessive knowledge about entities the individual had no prior contact with. All phenomena that can be explained either supernaturally or psychologically. Real religious conversion often involves similar experiences: visions, irresistible compulsions, sudden certainties that feel externally imposed rather than internally generated. Lovecraft exploits this phenomenological similarity to make his cult recruitment feel psychologically realistic, even while describing impossible entities. The cultist who claims Cthulhu, called to them through dreams, cannot be easily dismissed because real religious practitioners make identical claims about their deities, and we possess no definitive method for distinguishing genuine divine contact from psychologically generated religious experience. This ambiguity makes Lovecraft's cults more rather than less disturbing. We cannot confidently dismiss them as delusion when their psychological patterns mirror religious experience generally. As we examine how humans interact with these cults and what functions madness serves in Lovecraft's framework, we will see this ambiguity between supernatural and psychological becoming even more narratively and philosophically productive. The initiation descent, the progressive revelation of cult knowledge through stage ceremonies, directly mirrors mystery religion structures documented across ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern traditions. The Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, the Mithraic mysteries of Roman military culture, the Isis and Osiris mysteries of Hellenistic Egypt. All these genuine religious traditions organize themselves around progressive initiation, where participants received increasingly profound revelations through ritual experiences. Lovecraft encountered descriptions of these mystery traditions through classical education and comparative religion reading, recognizing that their structure possessed inherent narrative and psychological power. The core pattern involves initial purification, symbolic death and rebirth, revelation of sacred knowledge, and incorporation into the community of the initiated. His fictional cults replicate this structure with disturbing precision. The esoteric order of Dagon clearly initiates members progressively, with young Innsmouth residents receiving fuller revelation as they mature and demonstrate commitment. The initial stages might involve attendance at rituals without understanding their full meaning, followed by partial explanations of the Deep One's existence, then eventually direct contact with Deep Ones and participation in interbreeding. Each stage represents irreversible commitment. Once you have seen certain things, you cannot unknow them, cannot return to innocent ignorance. This irreversibility mirrors actual mystery religion psychology. Initiation transforms the participant permanently, marking them as different from uninitiated persons. Lovecraft exploits this psychological reality for horror purposes. His initiations transform participants not through spiritual enlightenment, but through exposure to cosmic truths that destroy conventional human categories. The descent into cult knowledge functions as inverse spiritual journey, where each revelation brings not closer to divine understanding, but deeper into existential horror that conventional human consciousness cannot accommodate without damage. The persistent description of cultists as degenerate reveals how Lovecraft's racial theories intersect disturbingly with cult membership in his fiction. Across his stories, cultists are disproportionately described using language indicating racial otherness, physical abnormality, or supposed biological degradation. The Innsmouth residents develop the Innsmouth look with fish-like features. The Louisiana Bayou cultists are described as mongrels of mixed racial ancestry. Various cult participants are characterized as physically or mentally deficient according to eugenic standards Lovecraft accepted. This pattern reflects Lovecraft's genuine belief that racial mixing and isolation from white Anglo-Saxon Protestant civilization led to biological and cultural degeneration, making such populations supposedly more susceptible to religious deviance. The cult membership thus functions in his fiction as both cause and evidence of degeneration. The degenerate turn to cults because their degraded state makes them unable to maintain civilized religion, and cult participation further degrades them through literal biological transformation or symbolic corruption. Modern readers must recognize this pattern as expression of Lovecraft's racism rather than anthropological observation, yet we must also acknowledge that it shapes the narrative structure of nearly every cult story he wrote. The technique creates an uncomfortable dynamic. Lovecraft's cosmic horror is genuinely effective and philosophically interesting, yet it is consistently deployed through racist frameworks that associate cosmic horror with racial otherness. Innsmouth cultists horrify partly because they worship alien entities, but also because Lovecraft describes them using language designed to evoke eugenic anxieties about racial degeneration. The Louisiana cultists are presented as threatening partly because of their religious practices, but equally because of their racial composition. This means that engaging seriously with Lovecraft's cult construction requires constantly separating effective horror techniques from racist deployment, recognizing that his genius for cosmic horror was tragically inseparable from his prejudices. The madness of insight represents Lovecraft's appropriation of Gnostic and mystical traditions that describe dangerous enlightenment, transforming spiritual elevation into psychological destruction. Genuine mystical traditions across cultures warn that spiritual knowledge can be dangerous. Kabbalistic texts caution that mystical study can drive practitioners mad if undertaken without proper preparation. Buddhist traditions describe meditation-induced psychological disturbances called meditation sickness. Gnostic texts portray gnosis as simultaneously liberating and alienating from conventional reality. Lovecraft read about these traditions and recognized their potential for cosmic horror. What if mystical enlightenment is accurate but unbearable? If seeing reality clearly destroys the psychological structures necessary for human functioning? His cultists frequently exhibit madness, not as error, but as consequence of accurate perception. They have seen cosmic reality, and their madness represents the only possible human response to such knowledge. Consider the narrator's description in The Call of Cthulhu. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. Someday, the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. This explicitly frames madness as the sane response to insane reality, inverting conventional assumptions about delusion and clarity. The cultists are mad because they are seeing clearly, while the sane majority remains ignorant of cosmic truth. This represents sophisticated engagement with epistemological questions raised by mystical traditions. If enlightenment reveals reality incompatible with human flourishing, is ignorance preferable to knowledge? Lovecraft's answer appears to be yes. The cultists have chosen knowledge over sanity, cosmic truth over human well-being, and the narratives consistently present this choice as tragic rather than heroic. Multi-generational cult families introduce the anthropological reality that secret societies often maintain themselves through kinship structures, with religious knowledge transmitted as family heritage rather than individual choice. Actual secret societies and esoteric traditions frequently operate this way. Certain Italian families maintained witchcraft traditions across generations. Jewish Kabbalistic knowledge often passed through family lineages. Indigenous shamanic traditions typically involve hereditary transmission. Lovecraft recognized that family-based transmission provides cults with remarkable persistence. Children raised within cult frameworks accept its reality as natural rather than aberrant, making conversion unnecessary and defection unlikely. The Marsh family in The Shadow over Innsmouth exemplifies this pattern. 3 generations maintain and deepen the family's relationship with deep ones, with each generation more fully committed than the last. The protagonist eventually discovers his own Marsh ancestry, learning that he has inherited not just family history, but biological predisposition toward transformation and cult membership. This hereditary element introduces determinism into cult participation. Individuals may be born into cults without choice, their religious identity predetermined by ancestry rather than personal decision. The technique mirrors actual religious sociology, where most people maintain the religion of their birth family, but Lovecraft characteristically makes this more disturbing by linking religious inheritance to biological inheritance. The cult families don't just teach their traditions, they breed them with religious knowledge inscribed in genetics rather than merely transmitted through socialization. This biological determinism reflects early 20th century eugenic thinking, while also creating genuinely disturbing narrative possibilities. If cult membership is hereditary, then entire populations might be predisposed toward cosmic horror worship, and religious identity might be as unchosen as eye color or blood type. The madness question, whether cultists are victims of mental illness who construct elaborate religious frameworks around delusions, or whether they are accurate observers of cosmic reality that happens to be incompatible with sanity, represents moral ambiguity that Lovecraft deliberately cultivates. Traditional horror often presents clear distinction between deluded madmen and actual supernatural threats, but Lovecraft's narratives consistently refuse this clarity. His cultists claim direct contact with cosmic entities, describe theological frameworks explaining their worship, and maintain traditions across generations, all behaviors consistent with genuine religious communities. Yet the entities they describe violate known physical laws, their theology contradicts scientific understanding, and their practices often involve violence or transgression that conventional morality condemns. The narratives provide just enough evidence to suggest the cultists might be correct, without definitively confirming it until very late, if at all, creating sustained ambiguity about whether we are encountering religious truth or collective delusion. This ambiguity reflects actual challenges in evaluating religious claims. We possess no reliable method for determining whether unusual religious experiences represent genuine divine contact or psychological phenomena, whether theological claims reflect cosmic reality or human projection. Lovecraft exploits this epistemological uncertainty to destabilize reader confidence. If we cannot dismiss the cultists as simply mad, if their claims might be accurate, then cosmic horror becomes possible rather than safely fictional. The moral ambiguity extends to how we judge cultists themselves. Are they victims of mental illness deserving sympathy, criminals deserving punishment, or unfortunate witnesses to reality deserving pity? Lovecraft provides no easy answers, allowing different stories to suggest different possibilities while refusing any definitive framework for moral evaluation. Dreams as recruitment represents one of Lovecraft's most psychologically sophisticated cult mechanisms, drawing on genuine accounts of religious conversion through visionary experience that he had encountered in William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience and Similar Psychological Studies of Religion. James documented numerous cases where individuals reported sudden religious conversions following dreams, visions, or other altered state experiences that felt absolutely convincing, regardless of external verification. Lovecraft recognized that dreams provide perfect recruitment mechanism. They are universal human experiences. They feel real while occurring. They can introduce ideas and imagery the dreamer had no prior conscious contact with, and their content cannot be externally controlled or prevented. His cosmic entities, particularly Cthulhu, recruit sensitive individuals through dream transmission of imagery, mythology, and compulsion. The sensitive dreamers awaken with knowledge they cannot account for. They know chants in languages they have never studied. They recognize symbols they have never seen. They feel compelled toward behaviors or locations without understanding why. This dream recruitment mirrors actual religious conversion patterns while introducing cosmic horror element. If the dreams are objectively transmitted by cosmic entities rather than subjectively generated by sleeping brains, then no one is safe from potential recruitment. You could sleep tonight and awaken tomorrow as cult member, your religious identity transformed without conscious choice or ability to resist. The technique also creates perfect narrative ambiguity. We can never definitively determine whether a character's dreams represent genuine cosmic contact or psychological phenomena, whether their resulting cult membership reflects supernatural recruitment or mental breakdown. Lovecraft specifically chose dreams as recruitment mechanism, partly because this ambiguity mirrors actual religious experience. Believers in divine revelation and skeptics interpreting such experiences as psychological both use the same phenomenological evidence, disagreeing only about interpretation. Physical transformation themes exploit ecstatic cult traditions and bodily transcendence narratives while inverting their promised elevation into grotesque degradation. Real religious traditions across cultures promise or describe physical transformation through spiritual practice. Christian saints exhibit stigmata and levitation. Hindu yogis supposedly achieve siddhis, supernatural powers, through practice. Shamanic traditions involve spirit possession that transforms the body's capabilities. Ecstatic traditions describe bodily transfiguration during mystical union. Lovecraft read anthropological accounts of these traditions, recognizing that physical transformation narratives possess psychological power. They make spiritual claims tangible. They provide physical evidence of religious reality. They mark the transformed individual as genuinely different from conventional humanity. His cult narratives consistently feature physical transformation, but characteristically, the transformations are degrading rather than elevating. Innsmouth residents develop fish-like features as they age, becoming less human and more deep one. The witch Kezia Mason supposedly could transform her physical body to travel through non-Euclidean space. Various cultists exhibit physical marks, deformities, or changes that signal their religious status. These transformations serve multiple narrative functions. They make cult membership visible and permanent. You cannot hide or deny transformation. They provide body horror that complements cosmic horror, and they suggest that contact with cosmic reality physically damages human biology. The transformation also typically involves loss of conventional humanity. The Innsmouth residents literally become less human as they develop deep one characteristics, their transformation representing not spiritual evolution, but biological regression toward aquatic ancestors. This inversion of spiritual transformation narratives reveals Lovecraft's materialist horror at its most visceral, where conventional mysticism promises transcendence of physical limitations. Lovecraft's cults deliver physical degradation that reflects spiritual corruption, suggesting that contact with cosmic truth literally damages human biology. The question of why cultists cannot simply leave engages the psychology of closed religious systems and the concept of irreversible knowledge that Lovecraft understood from reading about actual cult psychology and coercive religious movements. Genuine high-commitment religious movements and what we now call cults often make departure psychologically and practically difficult. Members have invested heavily in the community. They have burned bridges with outside relationships. They possess knowledge or have committed acts that create mutual blackmail. And they have internalized frameworks where departure means spiritual death or damnation. Lovecraft's fictional cults exhibit all these retention mechanisms while adding cosmic horror element. You cannot leave because what you have learned cannot be unlearned, because you have seen what cannot be unseen, because contact with cosmic entities has permanently altered your consciousness or biology. The Innsmouth cultists cannot leave partly because the entire town is implicated in the cult, partly because their biological transformation would mark them as strange anywhere else, and partly because their contact with deep ones has created bonds that transcend conventional human relationships. The protagonist of The Shadow over Innsmouth attempts to escape, but eventually embraces his heritage, suggesting that exposure to cult reality makes rejection psychologically impossible. This represents Lovecraft's most deterministic view of cult membership. It is not freely chosen religious identity that can be freely abandoned, but rather permanent transformation that forecloses return to previous existence. The technique creates claustrophobic horror. Once cult contact occurs, no escape is possible, and the rest of one's life involves either embracing this reality or living in denial of what one knows to be true. This mirrors actual psychology of individuals who have left high-commitment religious movements but cannot escape the psychological and social consequences of membership. Though Lovecraft characteristically makes this psychological reality literal through physical transformation and cosmic knowledge that genuinely cannot be unlearned or denied. As we examine what forbidden knowledge these cults possess, and how that knowledge destroys conventional epistemology. We will see these psychological patterns manifesting in cognitive and philosophical rather than merely social forms. The grimoire tradition, texts that supposedly contain dangerous magical knowledge whose mere reading corrupts or destroys the reader, provided Lovecraft with established literary and occult frameworks that he adapted for cosmic horror purposes. Real grimoires circulated throughout medieval and early modern Europe. The Key of Solomon, the Lesser Key of Solomon, Lemergeton, the Sworn Book of Honorius, the Picatrix, and numerous others claim to contain instructions for summoning spirits, performing magical operations, and accessing hidden knowledge. These texts were genuinely feared by religious authorities and simultaneously sought by occult practitioners, their reputation built on the belief that certain knowledge was spiritually dangerous. Lovecraft read about grimoire traditions extensively, encountering descriptions in anthropological texts, occult histories, and probably examining some grimoires themselves in the Providence Athenaeum's collection. He recognized that grimoires served multiple narrative functions. They provided documentation for magical practices. They created hierarchies of knowledge. Only some people could access certain texts. They introduced material evidence for supernatural claims. If the book exists physically, perhaps its contents are real, and they allowed knowledge to persist across time, independent of living practitioners. His fictional grimoires, particularly the Necronomicon, follow this established tradition while amplifying the danger. Reading these texts doesn't merely risk spiritual corruption, but threatens sanity itself, as the knowledge they contain is incompatible with human cognitive structures. The Necronomicon supposedly was written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred in Damascus around 730 CE, was translated into Greek and Latin, and now survives in only a few copies scattered across university libraries. This textual history mimics actual grimoire transmission, original composition in the Near East or Mediterranean, translation across languages, suppression by authorities, and survival in rare copies accessible only to scholars or dedicated seekers. The technique creates multi-layered authentication. The text has history, has material presence, and has documented effects on those who read it, making its forbidden knowledge feel genuinely dangerous rather than merely fictional. What cultists know that protagonists discover represents the core revelation structure that governs Lovecraft's horror narratives. The progressive realization that reality differs fundamentally from consensus understanding, and that this difference is existentially devastating. The cultists possess what we might call counter-cosmology, alternative frameworks for understanding the universe, Earth's history, humanity's place in cosmic structure, and the relationship between consciousness and reality. This counter-cosmology typically includes several elements. Earth is billions of years old and has hosted multiple non-human civilizations that preceded humanity. The entities humans occasionally encounter as gods are actually material beings from other dimensions or distant cosmos who regard humanity with indifference. Human consciousness and civilization represent temporary and insignificant fluctuations in cosmic processes operating at incomprehensible scales, and certain locations, times, and mental states allow contact between human reality and cosmic forces that will eventually reclaim Earth. This knowledge structure mirrors genuine alternative cosmologies, Gnostic Christianity's portrayal of material reality as corrupt creation by a false god, Hindu and Buddhist cosmologies describing vast temporal cycles where human existence is infinitesimal, indigenous cosmologies describing spiritual realities underlying material appearance. Lovecraft studied these alternative frameworks and recognized that they possess genuine psychological power. They reframe conventional understanding in ways that make human concerns seem trivial or delusional. His genius was recognizing that these reframings could be deployed not for spiritual comfort, but for existential horror. What if the alternative cosmology is accurate and consensus reality is comforting delusion? The cultists know this counter-cosmology either through inherited tradition, through direct revelation, or through studying forbidden texts that compile evidence conventional scholarship ignores. Their knowledge transforms them, because knowing fundamentally alters how one exists in the world. You cannot live conventionally once you understand that convention is built on comprehensive misunderstanding of reality. The Necronomicon, as synthesis of real forbidden book legends, deserves extended analysis because it represents Lovecraft's most successful single invention, a fictional grimoire that has achieved quasi-reality through cultural repetition and appropriation. Lovecraft created the Necronomicon gradually across multiple stories written between 1924 and 1935, elaborating its history and contents through scattered references rather than comprehensive exposition. The book's original Arabic title, Al-Azif, supposedly referred to nocturnal insect sounds that Arabs superstitiously attributed to demons, a detail that demonstrates Lovecraft's technique of providing culturally specific etymology that sounds plausible without being verifiable. The author, Abdul al-Hazred, supposedly was a Yemenite poet who traveled throughout the Empty Quarter and encountered pre-Islamic ruins where he learned cosmic truths that drove him mad. This biography mirrors legends of real occult authors like Hermes Trismegistus or Christian Rosenkreutz, figures whose historical existence is doubtful, but whose attributed texts circulated widely. The book's textual history, composition in Arabic, translation into Greek by Theodorus Philetas of Constantinople, translation into Latin by Olaus Wormius in 1228, with the original Arabic text lost, and only the Latin translation surviving in a few copies, exactly mirrors the transmission history of actual medieval grimoires and philosophical texts, where knowledge often survived only through multiple translations, with original versions lost. Lovecraft provides specific library locations for surviving copies. Miskatonic University's library supposedly holds one of the few Latin editions, as does the British Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and the Library of Buenos Aires University. This specificity invites verification. Readers could theoretically visit these institutions and request the text, though they would obviously find it absent because it is entirely fictional. The contents are described fragmentarily across Lovecraft's stories, passages discussing the old ones, chants for summoning entities, astronomical information about when the stars are right, and descriptions of non-Euclidean geometries that allow interdimensional travel. The fragmentary revelation mirrors how real grimoires are discussed in occult literature, always referenced, occasionally quoted, but rarely reproduced completely, maintaining mystique through partial accessibility. Cultic astronomy and wrong celestial knowledge introduces the disturbing possibility that the cosmos operates according to patterns conventional astronomy doesn't recognize or deliberately ignores. Lovecraft was fascinated by astronomy, regularly reading popular astronomy books and articles, and he recognized that astronomical knowledge carries particular authority in modern culture. It represents objective, mathematical, verifiable science that transcends cultural bias. His cultists possess alternative astronomical knowledge. They track stellar configurations that supposedly influence when cosmic entities can manifest. They recognize patterns in celestial movements that conventional astronomy dismisses. They possess star maps showing cosmic structures that human science hasn't detected. This wrong astronomy serves multiple purposes. It suggests that scientific knowledge might be incomplete or deliberately limited. It provides cultists with predictive capacity, knowing when the stars are right, and it transforms the night sky from object of scientific wonder into source of cosmic threat. The technique specifically targets astronomical science because that science is so culturally authoritative. If even our most objective mathematical knowledge might be wrong, then nothing is reliable. Lovecraft likely drew inspiration from real alternative astronomical traditions. Astrology claims celestial patterns influence human affairs. Various occult traditions describe planetary intelligences or celestial hierarchies conventional astronomy doesn't recognize, and ancient astronomical traditions, Babylonian, Mayan, possessed sophisticated mathematical knowledge encoded in frameworks modern science considers superstitious. By giving his cultists alternative astronomy, Lovecraft suggests that these dismissed traditions might preserve knowledge that modern science has lost or refuses to acknowledge. The cultist watching the night sky isn't engaged in superstition, but in recognition of patterns that scientific astronomy cannot or will not see, a possibility made disturbing precisely because astronomical science seems so secure and objective. Archaeological evidence provides cultists and investigators with material proof that challenges conventional historical narratives, introducing physical artifacts that shouldn't exist according to consensus chronology. Lovecraft lived during a period of spectacular archaeological discoveries. Tutankhamun's tomb, 1922, ongoing excavations at Sumerian sites, discoveries of Indus Valley civilization, and emerging recognition that human history extended far deeper than biblical chronology suggested. Newspapers regularly reported discoveries that challenged or complicated historical understanding, and Lovecraft avidly followed such accounts. His fictional archaeological record includes artifacts that conventional archaeology cannot explain, idols depicting entities unknown to mythology, architectural structures employing non-Euclidean geometries, inscriptions in languages that predate known writing systems, and evidence of civilizations that flourished before humanity supposedly evolved. These artifacts function as material evidence for cultist cosmology. Cultists are not merely believing unprovable claims, but maintaining traditions corroborated by physical evidence that conventional scholarship dismisses as anomalous or misinterpreted. Inspector Legrasse's discovery of the cult idol in Louisiana, which exactly matches a Greenland sculpture and resembles motifs found in Pacific islands, provides material evidence for global Cthulhu worship that preceded European colonization. Professor Wilmarth's examination of strange footprints and alien artifacts in Vermont provides physical proof that the folklore of the hills preserves accurate knowledge about non-human entities. These archaeological elements create epistemological crisis. Either the physical evidence is somehow misinterpreted, requiring elaborate alternative explanations, or the cultist cosmology is accurate and conventional history is wrong. Lovecraft deliberately structures narratives to make the second option increasingly plausible, forcing readers to recognize that material evidence supports the cultists' seemingly insane claims. This technique exploits genuine historical reality. Archaeology regularly discovers artifacts that complicate or challenge existing narratives, and consensus interpretations sometimes take decades to adjust to anomalous evidence. Linguistic keys and translation dangers represent Lovecraft's most sophisticated exploration of how knowledge can be dangerous at the level of language itself, drawing on medieval anxieties about translation of philosophical and magical texts. Medieval and Renaissance Europe witnessed extensive translation of Arabic philosophical, scientific, and magical texts into Latin, often accompanied by warnings that certain knowledge was dangerous if translated, or that translation itself might corrupt the original meaning in ways that release dangerous forces. Lovecraft encountered these translation histories through his reading and recognized their narrative potential. If certain texts are dangerous in original languages, the danger might intensify or change through translation, and the act of translation itself might constitute a kind of magical or psychological operation. His fictional grimoires consistently involve translation anxiety. The Necronomicon supposedly lost something in translation from Arabic to Greek to Latin, with the Arabic original considered most dangerous because it preserved the knowledge in its purest form. The cultist chants are described as only approximately translatable, their true meaning exceeding what English or any human language can capture. This introduces the disturbing possibility that human languages are themselves inadequate for expressing cosmic realities. We lack not just words, but fundamental linguistic structures necessary to accurately describe what the cultists know. The translation danger also appears in narratives where investigators studying cult documents gradually realize what they're reading, the understanding arriving not as sudden revelation, but as creeping comprehension that cannot be reversed once achieved. This mirrors actual experiences of reading difficult philosophical or mystical texts, where meaning emerges gradually and transforms understanding irreversibly. Lovecraft thus treats knowledge itself as infectious or corruptive. Once you understand the translation, once the meaning clicks into place, you cannot unknow it, and your consciousness has been permanently altered by linguistic contact with ideas that human cognitive structures weren't designed to accommodate. Visual corruption, cult symbols that damage sanity through perception, represents Lovecraft's extension of forbidden knowledge into the realm of pure sensation, suggesting that certain patterns or forms are inherently dangerous to human consciousness. This concept likely drew inspiration from multiple sources: occult traditions describing barbarous names, and sigils that supposedly possess inherent power, psychological research into optical illusions and patterns that induce altered states, and possibly early psychedelic research describing visual patterns associated with consciousness alteration. His cultists use symbols, idols, and architectural structures whose forms somehow violate human perceptual expectations. Non-Euclidean angles in buildings that hurt to look at, idol shapes that seem to shift depending on viewing angle, symbols that induce trance states or disturbing dreams in viewers. The shining trapezohedron in The Haunter of the Dark exemplifies this, a physical object whose visual properties allow viewers to see across dimensions. the seeing itself constituting contact with Nyarlathotep. This visual corruption suggests that human consciousness isn't merely endangered by knowledge transmitted through language, but by certain sensory patterns themselves, as if the structure of cosmic reality, when directly perceived, overwhelms cognitive structures evolved for navigating mundane Earth environments. The technique exploits genuine perceptual psychology. Certain visual patterns do induce altered states, stroboscopic effects, certain geometric patterns, certain architectural proportions do create psychological effects, cathedrals designed to induce awe, and optical illusions demonstrate that perception isn't simply objective reception of external reality, but active construction that can be disrupted. Lovecraft simply extends these real perceptual vulnerabilities into cosmic horror territory. What if there are patterns that human consciousness cannot safely process, geometries that our spatial reasoning cannot accommodate, and visual forms that reveal realities our minds aren't equipped to contain? Documentation itself, as dangerous knowledge, represents Lovecraft's most philosophically sophisticated horror concept. The idea that recording, preserving, and transmitting certain knowledge constitutes irresponsible or even evil act, echoing medieval prohibitions against copying grimoires and religious restrictions on preserving certain teachings. Real religious traditions often maintain that certain knowledge must remain oral, never written, because written preservation makes it too accessible to those unprepared for it. Kabbalistic traditions restricted certain teachings. Indigenous shamanic knowledge often remains oral, specifically to control transmission, and medieval authorities burned magical texts to prevent their proliferation. Lovecraft's narratives consistently feature protagonists who compile documentation, organizing their granduncle's papers, assembling witness testimonies, correlating fragmentary evidence, and this documentation itself becomes dangerous. The narrator of The Call of Cthulhu explicitly worries that by organizing the evidence into coherent narrative, he is creating a document that might corrupt future readers exactly as he has been corrupted by assembling it. Professor Wilmoth, in The Whisperer in Darkness, destroys much of his collected evidence, recognizing that its preservation poses danger. This represents awareness that information transmission has ethical dimensions. Some knowledge might genuinely be better suppressed, not because it's false, but because it's true and damaging. The position challenges Enlightenment assumptions about knowledge being inherently valuable and suppression being inherently wrong. Lovecraft's fiction suggests instead that certain truths are incompatible with human flourishing, that knowledge and wisdom might conflict rather than align, and that those who possess dangerous knowledge face genuine ethical dilemmas about whether to preserve, transmit, or destroy what they have learned. This precisely mirrors medieval grimoire prohibition logic, though Lovecraft secularizes it. The danger isn't spiritual corruption, but psychological destruction, not sin, but madness, not damnation, but epistemic collapse that makes conventional human existence impossible. As we turn to examining how these cult concepts manifested in Lovecraft's actual stories, we will see all these theoretical elements becoming concrete narrative patterns that demonstrate how philosophical horror becomes literary technique. The Call of Cthulhu, published in Weird Tales in February 1926, established the template that would govern nearly all subsequent Lovecraftian cult narratives: fragmented documentation, global distribution, and the gradual realization that scattered evidence points toward unified cosmic horror. The story's framing device presents the narrative as manuscript left by the late Francis Wayland Thurston of Boston, who died under mysterious circumstances after compiling materials inherited from his granduncle, Professor George Gammell Angel of Brown University. This nested structure immediately signals that we are not receiving straightforward fiction, but rather recovered documentation requiring interpretation, placing readers in investigative rather than passive position. The narrative comprises 3 major sections: the horror in clay, describing a Rhode Island sculptor's disturbing dreams and bas relief; the tale of Inspector Legrasse, recounting a 1907 Louisiana police raid on a swamp cult; and The Madness from the Sea, detailing a Norwegian sailor's encounter with risen Aurelia in 1925. Each section initially appears disconnected, but Thurston's analysis reveals they describe the same entity, Cthulhu, worshipped globally by cults operating independently, yet maintaining remarkably consistent mythology. This global distribution establishes one of Lovecraft's key cult characteristics. These are not isolated aberrations, but manifestations of something genuinely widespread, suggesting either ancient diffusion or independent contact with the same cosmic reality. The technique transforms what could be dismissed as local superstition into potential global phenomenon, making the horror feel more threatening precisely because it cannot be geographically contained or culturally isolated. Inspector Legrasse's Louisiana raid, set in November 1907, provides the story's most detailed cult ethnography and demonstrates how Lovecraft synthesized genuine contemporary anxieties about voodoo with his cosmic horror framework. Legrasse leads a party of police and citizens into Louisiana swamps, following reports of women and children disappearing, eventually discovering approximately 100 men, described with Lovecraft's characteristic racist language as mentally aberrant mongrels and Negroes and a sprinkling of mulattoes, performing rituals around a bonfire where a ritual victim is being prepared for sacrifice. The cultists dance in a ring, chanting Fungui Mogulwinaf Cthulhu Rulia Ugahnago Dargan repeatedly, their movements described as simultaneously primitive and disturbing in their coordination. Lovecraft's description draws directly on sensationalist newspaper accounts of supposed voodoo ceremonies in Haiti and Louisiana that circulated in American press during the 1920s, accounts that combined genuine anthropological fragments with racist fantasy and colonial anxiety about black religious practices. The raid results in arrest of 47 cultists and discovery of an idol, a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and 4 feet, and long, narrow wings behind. This idol becomes crucial physical evidence, material proof that cult belief has generated concrete artifacts that can be studied, preserved, and compared with other evidence. The description emphasizes its alien craftsmanship. It seemed to be made of stone and was covered with undecipherable hieroglyphs, suggesting manufacture by non-human, or at least non-Western hands. The captured cultists provide remarkably consistent accounts of their theology despite claiming no contact with each other. They worship old ones who ruled Earth before humanity, who now lie dead but dreaming in various locations, who will return when the stars align properly, and who communicate through dreams to sensitive individuals. This consistency across supposedly independent cultists provides the first suggestion that their beliefs might reflect objective reality rather than shared delusion. The Horror at Red Hook, written in 1925, though not published until 1927, represents Lovecraft's most explicitly xenophobic cult narrative, where immigrant communities in Brooklyn become sites of resumed ancient worship. The story describes Detective Thomas Malone's investigation of the Red Hook neighborhood, which Lovecraft portrays as having been overrun by immigrants, Syrian, Spanish, Italian, and Negro elements, whose alien religious practices supposedly threaten American civilization. The narrative suggests that these immigrant communities have brought old world cults to America, resuming worship that conventional immigration assumes left behind in source countries. Lovecraft describes secretive rituals in basement temples, kidnappings of women and children, and the presence of hybrid spawn resulting from these practices. The cult here lacks the organized structure of the esoteric order of Dagon or even the Louisiana swamp cultists. Instead, it appears as diffuse network operating through ethnic enclaves that conventional authorities cannot effectively penetrate. This represents Lovecraft's anxiety about immigration transforming American cities into spaces where dangerous foreign practices can establish themselves beyond oversight or control. The story is important for understanding Lovecraft's cult construction, not because it is effective horror. Most critics consider it one of his weaker efforts, but because it reveals how completely his cosmic horror was entangled with racist xenophobia. The cosmic entities worshipped in Red Hook are less important than the fact that their worshippers are immigrants of color, and the horror derives as much from cultural anxiety about demographic change as from genuinely cosmic dread. This connection between cult activity and racial otherness would persist throughout Lovecraft's work, though later stories would integrate it more subtly into narratives that achieved greater artistic success. The Theosophical Society echo appears most prominently in The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, written 1927, though not published until 1941, where Lovecraft depicts organized occultism operating within respectable social contexts. Joseph Curwen, the 18th century sorcerer whose resurrection drives the narrative, maintained what appeared to be a philosophical society in colonial Providence, gathering followers interested in alchemical and occult knowledge while actually conducting necromantic rituals that required constant supply of corpses and living victims. This structure mirrors how actual occult organizations like the Theosophical Society or Golden Dawn operated. Public presentation as philosophical or scholarly societies pursuing esoteric wisdom, with more disturbing practices supposedly limited to inner circles of advanced members. Curwen's organization possessed hierarchical structure, with outer members receiving partial teachings, while inner circle conducted actual magical operations. The cult maintained extensive correspondence with similar groups in Europe, creating an international network of occult practitioners who shared knowledge and collaborated on operations, exactly how actual occult societies operated during the 18th and 19th centuries. Lovecraft clearly drew on his knowledge of real occult organizational structures when constructing current society, replicating their social forms while replacing their relatively harmless actual practices, ceremonial magic, meditation, symbolic ritual, with genuinely horrific necromancy and dimensional transgression. The technique demonstrates Lovecraft's understanding that cults need not operate as isolated or obviously aberrant groups, but can function as apparently respectable social organizations whose true nature remains hidden, even from many participants. Kerwin maintained his position in colonial Providence society for decades, his occult activities known only to inner circle, while outer observers simply saw a successful merchant with philosophical interests. This urban, socially integrated cult model contrasts sharply with the isolated, degenerate cult communities of stories like The Shadow over Innsmouth, demonstrating that Lovecraft recognized diverse models for how forbidden worship could persist within civilized society. The establishment of recurring patterns across early stories created what would become standard Lovecraftian cult structure: isolated discovery by investigator, correlation of fragmentary evidence, revelation that evidence points toward unified cosmic threat, and suppression or madness preventing widespread disclosure. This template appears in The Call of Cthulhu, The Dunwich Horror, 1928, The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, and most other mature Lovecraft narratives involving cults. The pattern serves multiple purposes. It maintains cosmic horror's fundamental ambiguity by never providing definitive proof that would convince skeptical authorities. It creates narrative tension through investigation and gradual revelation, and it suggests that cult activities are widespread but remain unknown to general public because evidence never circulates beyond individual investigators who either suppress it or are suppressed themselves. The recurring structure also allowed Lovecraft to build cumulative effect across stories. Readers familiar with previous cult narratives would recognize patterns in new stories, creating sense that different stories were reporting on the same underlying phenomenon from different angles. This cumulative technique prepared readers for the collaborative mythos building that would begin in earnest during the late 1920s, where multiple authors would contribute to shared fictional cosmology. The early stories thus functioned not just as individual horror narratives, but as foundation for extended fictional tradition that would eventually achieve quasi-independent existence as the Cthulhu mythos. The academic investigator, as cult-adjacent, represents a recurring character type that appears across Lovecraft's narratives. University professors, independent scholars, or educated amateurs who study cult phenomena and gradually realize they are not merely observing, but becoming implicated in what they study. Professor Angel in The Call of Cthulhu dies mysteriously after his cult research advances too far. Professor Wilmarth in The Whisperer in Darkness barely escapes after his investigation of Vermont. Cult activities brings him into direct contact with the entities worshipped. Dr. Armitage in The Dunwich Horror must actively combat cult operations using knowledge drawn from the same grimoires the cultists consult. This pattern reflects genuine anthropological and religious studies dynamics. Scholars who study religious movements too intensively sometimes convert to, or at least become sympathetic with what they initially approached skeptically, a phenomenon well documented in academic literature on participant observation and researcher reflexivity. Lovecraft transforms this scholarly phenomenon into horror. The investigator cannot maintain objective distance because cosmic horror, once recognized, cannot be objectively studied without psychological and sometimes physical danger. The academic investigator occupies uncomfortable middle ground, not yet cultist, but no longer innocent observer, possessing knowledge that separates them from conventional humanity while not fully accepting cult cosmology. This liminal position allows Lovecraft to explore epistemological horror. The scholar knows enough to recognize that cultists are not simply deluded, but cannot fully accept implications of cult cosmology without abandoning academic identity and materialist worldview. The tension between scholarly objectivity and existential recognition drives many of Lovecraft's best narratives, suggesting that genuine investigation of cosmic horror inevitably compromises the investigator, making pure scholarship impossible and conversion or madness increasingly likely outcomes. As we